So we have OCHIAI Kaichi from Risshō University talking about the logic of world constitution, Nishida Kitaro self-awareness. I can share the text. So please, OCHIAI-san, you can start reading if you want.
微妙に間違えていることが適宜修正しながら読みます。Introduction. Some Nishida's thoughts often referred to as a Nishida philosophy. It's frequently introduced as a synthesis of Western and Eastern philosophies. But such a description is not entirely incorrect. It does not accurately convey the structure of Nishida's philosophical system. Throughout his life, Nishida pursued the concept of reality, just like as the central object of his philosophical inquiry. Both Western logic and Eastern thought serve as a valuable interlocutors in his expression of reality. What is crucial, however, is the position Nishida assigned to these interlocutors in the construction of his own logic. The concept of self-awareness, jigaku, is one of the representative technical terms in Nishida philosophy and can be regarded as the mechanism that constitutes the world we live in and ultimately reality itself. In this presentation, I will focus on this concept of self-awareness, referencing Nishida's midfield of the self-aware system of universes, and engaging with Kant and Kantian concept of consciousness in general. Examine self-awareness as the principle by which the world is constituted. Self-awareness refers to the knower knowing itself as the knower. In this process, the self is distinguished into the knower and the known. Nishida calls the knower the universal, and the known becomes its content. Nishida asserts that all knowledge that constitutes or cognition is established through the universal determining its own content. And this means that the essence of knowing is not in external observation, but in internal insight. Therefore, self-determination, 自己限定 of the universal can be seen as another expression of self-awareness. The three stages of the universal, the judgmental universal, self-aware universal, and the intelligible universal, 可能的一般者、自覚的一般者、意識的一般者. Each stage determines a different aspect of being. Thus, in Nishida's philosophy, one refers to the totality of contents determined by each universal. These three stages are structured such that the judgmental universal is subsumed by the self-aware universal, and the self-aware universal is subsumed by the intelligible universal. And this means that the earlier universals become the contents of the later ones. However, even the intelligible universal is not the final universal. And Nishida refers to the true ultimate universal as the universal of absolute nothingness, the timeless function. Or more frequently in his terminology, the place of absolute nothingness, the timeless function. Before discussing the place of absolute nothingness, we must first note that the relationship between the universal and its content is identified with the relationship between nothingness and being. For example, the universal and its contents are like the relationship between color and light. In this analogy, what is opposed to red is always the color, and the concept of color itself does not become content. Nishida expresses the universal as nothingness because it does not become content once, but rather serves to their limit content. The term phrase virtue emphasizes that this nothingness is a precondition for determining being. If the universal is nothingness, then why is it divided into three stages? This question is addressed by the concept of relative nothingness. Each of the three universals is considered nothingness within its own domain of determination. However, when a universal that should be nothingness is served as an objection by another universal, its nothingness becomes a relative, meaning it possesses the nature of being. Returning to the beginning, the universe is the knower. Then, what is a truly knowing universe? That is absolute nothingness. Thus, the structure of subsumption among the three universes can be seen as a path from the judgmental universe, which has the highest proportion of the self as known, towards the place of absolute nothingness, which is a true knower. In the self-determination of the judgmental universe, the relationship between the knower and the known is primarily that of subject and predicate in judgment. Individual entities serve as a subject but not as predicate. Whereas the universal concept can function as both. The development of universal concept exemplified by the relationship between color and red remain abstract unless expressed through judgment. Only when an individual expresses itself through judgment, the universal concept gains significance as an experience. And there can be countless expression of individual through general concept. This one is first, this one is right, and so on, etc. However, an individual with countless predicate expression cannot be determined merely as a unification of those expressions. The fact that the individual exists as a subject necessitates a universal that subsumes the subject predicate relationship itself. Thus, Nishida introduced the transcendental predicative field, 超越的術語 that transcendent and subsumes all predicative expressions. And this transcendental predicative field is a true knower in the self-determination of the judgmental universal. Otherwise, it is nothingness. And because it is nothingness, it cannot be determined as a subject within the judgmental universal. Therefore, what appears as the content of judgment is only the expression of the individual, which is determined by itself through general universal concept. In the self-determination of the judgmental universal, what is ultimately determined is the judgmental universal itself. For self-awareness does not merely know the contents of judgment, but knows the field in which judgment occurs as the self. However, the transcendental predicative field cannot be determined by judgment, leading to a contradiction. Simply, what is revealed by the judgmental universal in our self-consciousness is only the representational awareness that determines there is something, and it lacks the self that necessarily accompanies such awareness. The self-aware universal, therefore, is the universal that determines the judgmental universal as its own content. Yet its objectivity, the transcendental predicative field determined by the self-aware universal, is called the theoretical self, 知的自己. As mentioned earlier, the relativity of the universal that should be a nothingness becomes evident and is negative, thereby manifesting the structure of such subsumptions among the universals as a dynamic movement. The natural world that appears as the determination of the judgmental universal is not an independent world, unrelated to oneself. It is a world that arises by assuming the logical relations appearing in the content of ourself as independent existence. Beyond the judgmental universal, which really reflects the existence of things, the self-aware universal subsumes such reflection as the content of its own consciousness. What we typically consider as our consciousness belongs to this universal. The knower of the self-aware universal is the original self, 意識的自己, which determines the contents of consciousness revealed through judgment as its own purposive awareness. And Nishida calls this structure purpose conscious act, 合目的的作用. This structure mirrors that of the judgmental universal, where individual entities express themselves through general concept. The difference lies in the fact that the original self embodies both the relationship of the nothingness and being, and the relationship between the transcendental predicative field and the individual entities, whereas the purpose conscious act with temporal continuity express itself and is determined non-temporal. And when this volitional activity is known objectively, it contradicts itself. This is because the self-aware universal, while grounding the continuity of the subjective self, cannot directly limit the self that exists in the objective world beyond the already determined contents of subjective consciousness. And this effort limits the self and the failure to do so of the volitional self to be subsumed by a higher universal. And Nishida identifies consciousness in general with the intelligible self as the self-determination of the intelligible universe. The intelligible self is a self that directly determines itself, grounding itself in objective value. However, according to Nishida, consciousness in general is a formal intelligible self, like the theoretical self of the judgment universe, and merely guarantees the objective validity of the self-consciousness. The ultimate intelligible self is the idea of the good or moral consciousness, 道徳的領地. And the intelligible self achieves self-identity by including the known within the knower. And such knower is one that morality determines itself as the idea of the good or consciousness, and it's not. It's self-determined. Therefore, all that is known by consciousness is called the moral self, 道徳的自己, which acts with the idea of the good as its purpose. The moral self, which follows the voice of the consciousness, is a determination subsumed by an intelligible self. It does not represent the determination of the intelligible self itself, nor does the idea of good reflect the actual world. And Nishida writes, the idea of good does not even mean that it is reflected in the actual world, nor can it be said that the actual is its expression. And this is because the moral self is self-determined by the form of orders, told, aiming towards the idea of good, but not guaranteed to achieve it. As moral selves, we are constantly monitored by a conscience and strive to realize it through practical reason. Yet we can never fully become conscious itself, thus contradicting ourselves. The objectivity of the self at the stage of the moral self is its wholeness or ought value. But the moral self cannot remain within the realm of ought value. Its objectivity collapses, and its existence is negated. So this negation, the place of absolute nothingness at the root of our actual world emerges within the logic of self-awareness. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. So we can start with question or discussion. Okay, I have a terminological question, very simple, but I'm curious to know. You translated 超越的 with transcendental, and I have always doubts. Should I translate with transcendent or with transcendental? So you prefer transcendental. So can you explain if there is a reason you choose this translation instead of transcendent?
日本語でいいですか？
もちろん、すみません。
一応ここではあんまり詳しく書こうと思って書けなかったんですけど、それに直接関わって説明できるかもわからないんですけど、西田が関東を肯定しつつ批判するときに使うのが、 その意識一般っていうものの形式性っていうところを挙げたと思うんですけど、それがなんで起きるかって言ったとき、カントは意思的自覚、意思的自己というものを考えていなかったという点を言っていて、で、それを考えたときに、超越的実語面を、知的自覚なわけですから、訳すときにそこに超越論的って使ってもいいのかなと思ったんですけど、あんまりちょっと正しいかわからないですけど、そこは僕もあんまり分かっていないところで、ぜひ教えていただけたらというところで、やっぱり、これはもう、ちょっと話がそうですけど、僕があんまり、英語は得意じゃないというのと、西田の語がいろいろとなところから来ているのかって、訳を選ぶときにどっちなのか迷ってしまって、いろんな文献を読むんです。結構、振
じゃあ
れ幅があ
私み
って、
たいですね。
っていう情けない話なんですけど、そういうところがあって、例えば、先ほど、他の方だと、お給料を食べている時にお話ししたんですけど、二者の作用っていうところと、働くということと行為というところが全部、アクトで説明できて、説明というか訳せてしまうっていうようなところがあったりして、で、西田がさっきおっしゃった、重ねたトランセンスの、これも超越という言葉を西田自身は多用したりするわけなんですけども、なんか意味合いを聞いていると、超越論的っていうような時もあって、そこの春別というのが僕もあんまりまだついていないっていうのがお恥ずかしいところなんですけど、そういうふうな。なんか言ってしまうと、正直あんまり自信がなくて訳してしまっているという感じで。
はい。
すいません。
ありがとうございました。実は去年はローマの世界大会でジョン・クルメルの発表で、彼が、割と超越的がトランセンデンタルに翻訳しましたね。それで、私、同じテキストをイタリア語に翻訳すれば、できるだけトランセンデントのような言葉を使ってみたんですが、でも、例えば確かに、関東の純粋理性批判に引用して、西田が超越的対象を使いますね。それで、その時に、リッケットのようにトランセンデンテスオブジェクトのようにイタリア語に翻訳すれば、でもカントはトランセンデンタルを使っていると思ったので、それ私もこういう問題が、ありますが、それで、落合さんに何か聞きたかった。ありがとうございました。他の質問はありますか？ Are there any other questions? どうぞ。
日本語でお願いします。
今の話ですけど、僕は午前中の講演では全部、超越的はトランセンデントで訳したんですけれども、それはどういう観点から見るかによって訳を変えてもいいと思うんですけれど、ただ僕が午前中話したことだと、結局サブジェクティビズムをどうやって乗り越えていくかっていうことが、やっぱり西田の中の関心にあって、で、それを単純にオブジェクティビズムでは解決できないので、どうやってコンシャスネスとか、サブジェクトっていう考え方を、西田なりに変えて、で、だから主観主義を通して主観主義を突破するっていう、徹底的批評主義っていう、ね、考え方があると思うので、例えばそこを強調しようとすると、超越論的って言ってしまうと、カントに似すぎてしまって、結局カントを通してさらにカントを超えたいっていうところの、なんか、意図がちょっと弱くなっちゃうんじゃないかなと思うんですね。
なるほど、わかりました。
だけどもちろん、訳しにくいし、皆さんご存知ですけど、当時は超越論的って言葉はなかったから、訳そうとするとトランセンデンタルは先見的って訳してることもあるので、西田が超越的と超越論的の両方知ってて超越的をピックアップしたとも言えないのかもしれないんだけれども、でもやっぱり今のように考えるとか、なんかどこから見るかっていう観点をはっきりさせるとより一体来るんじゃないか。で、僕の場合はやっぱり超越的っていう方が西田がやりたかったことがはっきりするのかなという。
そうですね。今回特に、てかほぼ使っているのが、やっぱり知的世界なんですけども、 その H 的世界の発想が、やっぱりその意識の思考作用というところから始めて、つまり我々の、どちらかというと、つまりあるものの側から始めて、いかにしてH 的なるもの、もしくはそれを超えた絶対無の場所というものに、考えることができるかというところから始めていて、で、その西田自身が重視していることとして、存在というか必要なものは最初から全てあるんだという、それを我々がどれぐらい自覚できているかどうかなんだという点が問題となっていて、そういう意味で西田はその最初の方に超越的自己という言葉を使っていまして、それを考えるとその超越的自己っていうのは絶対に考えて、トランセンデンタールではなくトランセンデントの方だと思うし、それは何でかというと、やっぱり主観的自己から見れば超越的だっていう話で、それを考えればそういうふうにトランセントの方で訳す方が正しいのかなと思う一方で、やっぱりノエシス的超越とかっていう時には、ややトランセンデンタールな方も入っていた気がするわけで、ちょっとここの紙の話が全然飛んでしまってるんですけど、のと、やっぱりカントの意識一般、もしくは純粋動学みたいなものが、西田の自覚の論理で言えば、知的自覚を、ある種、の客観的妥当性を与えるものとして考えられたものなんだっていう形で、そういうある種、形式的な知的自己だっていう話なわけなんですけども、それを考えた時のその超越的術語面の超越っていうのが、意識一般の内容としてのっていう意味で考えると、その超越論的って言い方もできなくはないかと、ちょっと苦しい曲ですけど、っていう話。
As in my talk this morning, Rickard uses both transcendent form and transcendental form. And for Rickard, big difference between them. So the thing is, whether to choose, it's a very sensitive problem. But if we want to contrast Nishida's philosophy with neo-Kantians, maybe we have to pick up the word transcendent. But while contrasting with phenomenology, I'm not confident in that. It could be transcendental, but depending on the context, I think. But at least Rickert knows the difference between that. Yeah. It's a historical fact.
Well, thank you very much. 勉強になりました。じゃあ、are there any other questions?
You cited a passage from Nishida, which says that the highest form of the self is the idea of the good. What happened to that idea in his later thought? I don't know any place that he ever associated the self with the good, aside from that statement in the Zendo Kenkyu. Why did it disappear? Or was a bigger idea the envelope in which it disappeared, which was absorbed? I don't know the answer either. I'm not asking. It's a mystery for me, yes.
日本語でもいいんですよ。
正確に言うと、道徳的、自己、つまり善のイデアと道徳的自己の関係を、その H 的世界の論文だとまだもう一段階、超えるというか、つまりゾレンを、超えるっていう話を西田はするんですけど、そうすると何が、起きるかというか何が出てくるかというと、迷える自己という言葉が出てくると、wandering self。それは何に迷うかというと、道徳的 な迷いではなくて、その存在、自己の存在の場所に迷うというか、そのつまり自己の存在そのものの否定っていうところに入ってくる。それがなんでできるかというと、その合意的価値、ゾレンっていうのを西田はその対照的価値だというふうに考えていて、それが何でかっていうと、その、妥協するしないっていうところでものを考えている。そのけど、西田のその迷える自己というところまでいくと、自己自身に本体的に基礎づけるその存在価値というところに、行き着くことができると。なので、その迷える自己っていうのは、全然その、道徳的自己と比べて、本来的自己なんだけど、その迷える自己があることで、その道徳的な良さというものが初めて出てくる。っていうような発想をしていて、そこから先になるともっとなんかよくわからない話をしていて、僕もちょっとついていけなくなるんですけども、少なくとも道徳的自己っていうところだけでは、その自己の罪だとか、悪だとかっていうところを、が出てこないというふうに医者は考えている。だからその上にというか、もっとより深いところには、その迷える自己っていうのがその道徳的自己より本来的な自己としてあるんだというふうに考えている。ちょっと日本語で言うしかできないです。
So, thank you very much, Ochiai-san, for your presentation. Okay, thank you very much once again.